There's technical difficulties before we start, but I'm very pleased indeed to welcome you all to the St. Cuthbert's lecture. Most of you know here that I arrived in 2019, and the first lecture was at the beginning of 2020, and I tried to organize the lecture for the end of March, but we were locked down about a week shy of the first St. Cuthbert's lecture. Thinking it would happen in 2021, I organized it again, but we were locked down once again. But I'm delighted to be able to introduce the lecture this year and our speaker, the Right Honourable Dominic Grieve Qc, who was our original lecturer, so this is really third time lucky. He was born in 1956, educated at Westminster School and Oxford University. He was called to the bar in 1980, in 1980, appointed a QC in 2008, and was elected as the MP for Beaconsfield in 1997. He was appointed as Her Majesty's Attorney General in 2010, and then was sacked by David Cameron in 2014, I think for opposing his proposed reforms to the Human Rights Act. He then became chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee, where he undertook reports into detention and rendition, which was frustrated to a degree by the security services and Theresa May, who wouldn't allow certain witnesses to give evidence. And he also chaired the Russian report, which again was frustrated in part because the terms of reference were limited, and also there was a 9-month delay in publication before the last election. He finally lost his seat in Beaconsfield in 2019, having had the whip withdrawn from him by the Conservative Party for opposing Brexit. He's married to Caroline and has 2 sons, and has been a practicing Anglican, very loyal member of the Anglican Church all his life. I just want to, before I hand over to Dominic, I just want to give you one anecdote which I think is particularly pertinent to this lecture. I was sitting next to the late Sir Harry Ognall over lunch, and we were talking about integrity in politics. And Harry Ognall said to me, "Can you name a politician with integrity?" And I said, "Yes, Dominic Green." And you couldn't argue with that. So on that note, Dominic, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that extremely kind introduction. And yes, it is an immense pleasure, after a 2-year delay, to have been able to dust down this talk, which I had prepared in February-March 2020. I hope update it properly, and then come here and join you. And quite apart from the prospect of spending a weekend in one of the most beautiful parts of our country, it seemed to me that it offered an opportunity for me to reflect on a subject, the nature of sovereignty and identity, which has become pretty prominent recently in our political affairs. And indeed, if I was to do this, this place couldn't be better chosen. The setting, created from a ruined priory of an international religious order, dissolved by King Henry VIII, part of which was later turned into a country house in a landscape of farmed valleys and wild moors, is quintessentially English and can be found in no other place on earth. I'd like to reassure you at the outset that this talk is not going to be about Brexit, or at least only indirectly so. That event certainly changed my political career and has given me much more time to write and give this type of talk. But that particular debate is now over, and for better or worse, the United Kingdom is seeking its future in new directions. Yet at the same time, those directions are being discussed in a way that makes frequent reference to our history and identity as a nation, and a need to recognise it. The rejection of EU membership was, as I could see from my mailbag at the time, often expressed in terms of its alleged incompatibility with our national principles of parliamentary sovereignty, democracy, our system of law, and indeed our difference from other countries. At that time, the slogan was "Take back control." But it was also being argued today that it's time to curb judicial interference in our national affairs, restore a more traditional form of governance in which the executive should be less constrained in its actions by judges or international obligations such as the European Convention on Human Rights. It's asserted that these are incompatible again with our national tradition. So I thought it might be a good time to step back and try to look at this subject, sovereignty. To do this, I think we have to start by looking at its origins, and hence the title of my talk. It's, of course, to Shakespeare that we owe the most striking expression of a vision of glorious independence. It's contained in the Sceptred Isle speech of John of Gaunt. Actually, I think my 18 times great-grandfather, not a ground for boasting, as his father, Edward III, is likely to be the ancestor of well over half of you sitting in this room. The speech comes in the play Richard II, the first of the great historical plays, and it's worth reading out. This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall or as a moat defensive to a house, against the envy of less happier lands, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England. But the character, John of Gaunt, then actually goes on in a rather different vein, lamenting the loss of sovereignty through the actions of King Richard II, his favourites, and interestingly, his foreign alliances. This nurse, this teeming womb of royal kings, feared by their breed and famous by their birth, renowned for their deeds as far from home for Christian service and true chivalry, as in the sepulchre in stubborn jury of the world's ransom, blessed Mary's son. This land of such dear souls, this dear, dear land, dear for her reputation through the world, is now leased out. I die pronouncing it, like to a tenement or pelting farm. England, bound in with a triumphant sea whose rocky shores beats back the envious siege of watery Neptune, is now bound in with shame, with inky blots and rotten parchment bonds. That England that was wont to conquer others hath made a shameful conquest of itself. And would the scandal vanish with my life, how happy then were my ensuing death. Now, the play was written in about 1595, and as you can perhaps deduce, is intensely political in its content. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the father of Henry Bolingbroke, soon to usurp the throne from Richard and have him murdered, was the founding father of the House of Lancaster, from whom the Tudors claimed legitimacy, and was articulating the eventual justification for King Richard's overthrow, namely, he had leased out the realm to its ruin. It was written as Elizabeth I was aging, and the future looked uncertain, and enemies numerous. It tells us something of how cultured Englishmen like to see their identity at the end of the 16th century, and probably rather less about the late 14th. Gaunt himself was definitely part of the international set of his time. He might now even be denounced as a citizen of nowhere. He was born abroad, as his name shows, at Ghent in Flanders. He spent 2 years of his life in Spain trying to become King of Castile, and quite a few others in Gascony speaking French. As I have on occasion gently pointed out to former colleague Jacob Rees-Mogg, when he started extolling the deeds of Gaunt's grandson Henry V and his longbowmen at Agincourt, when pressing the cause for leaving the EU, if Henry V had succeeded in his ambitions, England would have become the appendage of a larger, more popular, and much wealthier France, with the king living and enthroned in Paris. Vassalage indeed. But we shouldn't lightly dismiss Shakespeare's praise of some quintessentially English identity that set us apart from others. By the end of the 16th century, notions of English exceptionalism were very clear, and they ran back a long way and had a long way to go as well. Part of it lies in the early development of administrative centralization in an England by the 13th century unique for a state of its size in Europe and without the power of regional territorial magnates to challenge the crown by competing jurisdictions. At the heart of our present constitution, we talk today to the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. The Queen in Parliament, acting with the consent of her Lords and Commons, exercises power unlimited by any other authority. At least in theory, this means that any government with a parliamentary majority can pass a bill requiring us collectively to worship the moon every other Tuesday. Provided the Queen were minded to give royal assent to it, and no such assent has been withheld since the reign of Queen Anne, then that is the law of our land, and we could be punished for not complying. And such things may seem fanciful, but that was effectively what happened in the 1530s. When it first emerged in 1534, Henry VIII's Act of Supremacy showed the ability of the king, with parliamentary authority and consent, to coerce his subjects on matters of the deepest conscience and belief, and was used to entirely revolutionary effect, to overturn the existing order of Catholic Christianity under papal authority in England, an order that most contemporaries would have considered permanent and completely immutable. The destruction of this priory, despite the opposition shown in Yorkshire in the Pilgrimage of Grace, is testimony to the ruthlessness of royal policy at the time, and I think its lasting effect on our national psyche. When the struggle between Crown and Parliament was resolved in the latter's favour in the 17th century, the Bill of Rights of 1689 was enacted and created the powers and privileges that Parliament has today. It's with those self-same powers that Parliament in 1972, at the behest of the then Conservative government, enacted the European Communities Act, which gave primacy to EU law in this country, and again, in 2019, enacted the legislation to abolish it. Again, in 2020, enacted further legislation to extend it to the end of 2021, and I have to add, in the case of Northern Ireland, indefinitely, as a consequence of the withdrawal agreement negotiated by our Prime Minister. But to this idea, and indeed political doctrine of sovereignty, there's also closely linked the principle that it will only be exercised within certain limits. In 2015, we commemorated the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. We remembered not just a historical event, but the creation of a national narrative. The barons who were responsible for obtaining King John's assent had preoccupations far removed from our own. They were dealing with a king who was operating outside the norm of kingship in the early 13th century, not the 21st. But if as a peace treaty it was a total failure, it's become embedded in our national consciousness. Only last summer, it was being invoked in Edinburgh by a crowd of anti-vaxxers who claimed the right under Clause 61 of the Charter to assail the monarch by seizing her castle until the government dropped COVID regulations with which they disagreed and said were contrary to Magna Carta. The fact that Section 61 has not existed since 1216, and that it has never applied to Scotland anyway, as its brief existence long predated the Union, didn't seem to discourage them at all. The Charter was of great importance, because it reduced the ability of the Crown to raise money by arbitrary fines or levies. That meant that there was now little option but for the monarch to summon councils, or as they were called after 1320, parliaments, to approve general taxation. Once the Commons emerged as a distinct body by the end of the 13th century, this practice was institutionalised, as was the power of the Commons, as opposed to the Lords, to demand redress of grievances in return for the taxes they granted. But as importantly, the Charter expresses an insistence on concepts of justice that were seen by the barons as being overarching and inherent to the realm and land of England of which they were a part. It's particularly noticeable in the two surviving clauses, the only ones still in force, 39 and 40, which respectively concern the prohibition on punishment without due process of law, and the promise not to delay or deprive a person of justice. Very topical, the first one, because it's why you can't just seize oligarchs' money without a proper process or a basis for doing it. They're often cited today as the defining statements of the rule of law and the limits of arbitrary state power. The Charter also speaks more generally of a thing called the law of the land, the law of the kingdom, the law of England. None of this was written down in any collection or treatise in 1215, but it was supposed, at least in theory, to offer men justice according to their status. It drew on ideas of good and bad kingship that came from the Bible, and indeed the coronation oath which has existed in England since at least the 9th century. In the 100 years after the Charter was sealed, it was being invoked repeatedly. 1297, it became a statute. 1300, we have Essex peasants using it as a justification to complain of their lord's bailiff's behaviour in the manorial court. Kings were made to reissue it on accession. It was extended 6 times in the 14th century at the request of the Commons, so as to apply to all irrespective of social status. By the mid-15th century, we have a judge, Chief Justice Fortescue, writing a treatise, De Laudibus Legum Angliae, in praise of the laws of England. His work is a study in English exceptionalism. He says, "The King of England can't alter or change the laws of his realm at his pleasure," something relevant to who had the power in 2016 to trigger Article 50 to leave the EU. He contrasted this with the practice elsewhere in Christendom. He deprecated the use of torture, lauded the system of trial by jury and its uniqueness to England, and said, and I quote, "He would rather 20 evildoers to escape death through pity than one man be unjustly condemned." Yes, that was written in the 15th century by a lawyer judge. When I became Attorney General, I had to go and take the most complicated Tudor oath on appointment. I noted with interest that I was required to say, "I will duly and truly minister the Queen's matters and sue the Queen's process after the course of the law and after my cunning." Cunning in the 16th century rather than the Blackadder sense. My wisdom, I think, is what it means. "I will duly and in convenient time speed such matters as any person shall do in law have to do in law against the Queen, as I may lawfully do, without long delay, tracting or tarrying the party of his lawful process in that to me belongeth." So there I was, serving as the Queen's lawyer, and actually being made to promise, as required by Clause 40 of the Charter, that I wouldn't abuse my position to delay or deny justice to anyone else. But we mustn't get carried away with these idealizations of our unique and ancient liberties. Charters of rights were not uncommon in medieval Europe. In any case, they were often ignored. English kings authorized torture in breach of the common law by special warrant under the Privy Seal, exactly the same, actually, as President Bush did for the CIA after 9/11. Juries were rigged, coerced, justice was bought and denied. And under Henry VIII, Parliament was briefly overawed into allowing the creation of criminal offences for breaches of proclamations, albeit not without protest and an insistence that the death penalty could not be attached to a breach. In the century that followed the writing of Richard II by Shakespeare, these themes became prominent in the dispute between king and Parliament. 60 years before the Bill of Rights of 1689, Sir Edward Coke, the Chief Justice of James I, defied the king and argued his sovereignty was limited by rules of natural law and not just the need to govern through Parliament. James, coming from Scotland, lacked any concept of legality external to the fact that he was king. When at Newark, on the way to his coronation, he'd ordered the summary of execution of a cutpurse without any hearing or due process, causing consternation to his English entourage, as it was a flagrant breach of a statute of 1354. You had to have a trial. When the king, as an exercise of prerogative right, demanded that proceedings challenging the Crown's right to grant a benefice be stayed, Coke refused, saying, "The stay required by your Majesty is a delay of justice and therefore contrary to law and the judge's oath." Coke then went on to develop the idea of an ancient constitution, coming from the Anglo-Saxons, reinforced by Magna Carta and now subverted. This was a total myth, but it carried a lot of appeal. Later he went further and he said, "In many cases the common law will control acts of Parliament, sometimes adjudge them void. For when an act of Parliament is against common right and reason, or repugnant or impossible to be performed, the common law will control it and adjudge it void." In the 18th century, the great lawyer Blackstone dismissed this last statement as erroneous, because of course it implies ultimate judicial and not parliamentary supremacy. But the ghost still lurks. The Bill of Rights of 1689 asserted the primacy of Parliament over the will of monarchs and their ministers, and created the principle that the actions of Parliament can't be challenged in any court, and that it's open, and that its statutes are open to interpretation in our courts, but they can't be overturned. But if the justification for the Bill of Rights was that James II had sought, I quote, "to subvert and extirpate the laws and liberties of the kingdom," what if it's the government of the Crown with a parliamentary majority that seeks to do this? What the late Lord Hailsham described as the tyranny of the majority. On that, the Bill of Rights is silent. The Lords and Commons in Parliament saw themselves as the upholders and not the underminers of their reinvented tradition of Magna Carta. But the issue has not gone away, and actually has been at the heart of a lot of political controversy since. To take a few examples, it lies at the root of the argument of the American colonies in their Declaration of Independence, complaining of Parliament's oppressive taxes over which they had no say, led afterwards to the US Congress enacting a constitution that gives primacy to the judges to limit what Congress can do. The idea of overarching political rights was invoked at the time of the Great Reform Act of 1832, the Chartists in the 1840s, the suffragettes, who compared themselves to the barons of 1215 in demanding votes for women and resorting to violence when legislation for it was blocked by a parliamentary majority. Then there are those people who stood on the steps of the Dublin Mansion House in 1919 and repudiated UK parliamentary sovereignty in Ireland in the name of what they described as the sovereignty of the Irish people. And today, the same could conceivably happen in Scotland, whatever the UK Parliament and government says. After the 2016 referendum, some Leave supporters argued that it had constituted a return of sovereignty to the people, thus turning MPs like myself into mere agents for its implementation, and, I might add, traitors if we tried in Parliament to moderate its full intent or urge any reconsideration. And while our tradition of parliamentary sovereignty has, through practice over time, been hedged with conventions about the way the state should behave, those conventions can be ignored, and often are, when a government is facing threats to public order or national security, or even simply on the grounds of administrative convenience, provided they have a sufficient majority in Parliament to do it. Now, convention worked to stop the Labour government when it wanted to have 90-day and 42-day pre-charge detention, as the hostility of the Commons destroyed it. But convention has often failed to prevent abuse of power by public authorities, particularly towards vulnerable or relatively powerless groups, be it the elderly, children in care, the ill treatment of detainees, such as happened in Kenya during the Mau Mau Rebellion, or in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, or, as your rector so courageously denounced and identified, in Iraq. Most tellingly, governments with majorities can also ignore conventions and deeply respected principles when enacting legislation. As was shown in the Bancourt case in the House of Lords in 2009, Clause 40 of Magna Carta may prohibit exile without due process of law, but this didn't prevent a government making a law to authorise this in a British overseas territory so as to permanently exile the Diego Garcians from their island home when it was desired to turn it into a US military base. Even closer to home, the government got effectively a complacent parliament to rubber stamp draconian, and I have to say very poorly drafted regulations during the recent COVID epidemic, some of which you may have noticed proved impossible to enforce, and indeed in some cases created injustice. Harking after the simplicities of untrammelled parliamentary sovereignty also misses the part international legal obligations play in the observance of the rule of law. It collides directly with the way in which the rule of law has developed in the last century. In the course of more recent British history, but particularly since the end of the Second World War, we've increasingly embarked on policies that have developed and changed our laws through international engagement. Notwithstanding our pride in our sovereignty, successive British governments have sought to make the world a better, safer, more predictable place by participating in and encouraging the creation of international agreements governing the relationship of states. When I was Attorney General, I inquired of the Foreign Office as to how many treaties the United Kingdom was signed up to. They got into a terrible tizzy about this and refused to go back beyond 1834, which actually excludes England's earliest Treaty of Friendship with Portugal of 1386, negotiated by and for the benefit of John of Gaunt. But since 1834, they informed me that they had records of 13,200 treaties and agreements that the UK had signed and ratified, and I'm told that today the figure is closer to 14,000, making our country the greatest treaty-making power in world history. Most are still applicable. They range from the United Nations Charter, promoted by Eleanor Roosevelt as a Magna Carta for the 20th century, the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, to local treaties over fishing rights, and indeed, of course, our Withdrawal Agreement Act, which we came to with the EU. Over 700 contain references to the possibility of binding dispute resolution in the event of disagreements over interpretation. And most importantly, increasingly, be it the European Convention on Human Rights, or the UN Convention on the Right of the Child, or the creation of the International Criminal Court, they deal not just with interstate relations, but with the standards of behaviour between our state and those over whom it exercises power. Now, that's become so important that the Ministerial Code until 2015 made express and specific reference to the duty of United Kingdom ministers to respect our international treaty obligations. This wording was then changed deliberately by David Cameron in a fit of pique at being too often reminded about this point, probably by me, as it was one of my duties as Attorney General to ensure that the government always has an arguable case that it's complying with those international obligations. But the amendment didn't, in any case, remove the obligation, as the Cabinet Office conceded at the time. It's what is described as one of Lord Bingham's 8th principle of the rule of law. And if we abandoned it, we would be sanctioning anarchy on the international stage. And United Kingdom governments, for all their faults and some lapses, have been pretty consistent up to now about observing its principles. After all, we went to war in 1914 over the violation of Belgian neutrality, which we had guaranteed. when the then German Chancellor, whose country had also signed it, dismissed it as a scrap of paper. Not a week goes by without the Foreign Secretary informing Parliament of our determination to stand up for the international rules-based system, as it's called, against those who seek to undermine it, such as Russia, with its violent and unlawful actions against the Ukraine and its earlier annexation of the Crimea. Such declarations won't be taken seriously if your own government isn't observing those rules itself. When the Justice Secretary goes to Amsterdam to request that Russia's actions are investigated by the International Criminal Court, as he's just done, he does it on the basis that the United Kingdom accepts the jurisdiction of that court, even against ourselves in relation to our own behaviour. Now, some at present seem to be questioning the value of these obligations, arguing that we should reduce or, if necessary, ignore them. The process of leaving the EU has certainly provided an impetus for this, as one of the key arguments for going was argued to be the need to free us from the direct effect of EU law. But as has become apparent, leaving the European Union has not delivered perhaps the total freedom some sought. The United Kingdom government agreed, in order to reach a withdrawal treaty with the EU, which it considered advantageous, to accept the Northern Ireland Protocol, which created the requirement that the UK introduce border checks between Great Britain and Northern Ireland in order to maintain Northern Ireland's continuance in the single market. This was needed to meet our obligations under another treaty, the Good Friday Agreement, that there should be no hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. My colleague, Geoffrey Cox, lost office as Attorney General for pointing out that the Prime Minister couldn't fail to put in those border checks without breaching an international treaty he had just signed. Yet last autumn, the offending clauses of the Internal Markets Bill duly followed Geoffrey's resignation, accompanied by the assertion of the present Attorney General, Suella Braverman, that this was permissible as Parliament was sovereign and could therefore override the international legal obligation if it wished. That, I'm afraid, ignored the point that the duty not to breach the obligation is on the UK government. Ironically, it was then opposition in a sovereign parliament, because of the damage the proposal was going to do to our country's international standing, that effectively stopped this from happening. All this highlights for me that there would appear to be some discomfort over the impact of international law on our sovereignty when it places a restraint on the United Kingdom's right to legislate at will on domestic matters. I don't want to get too diverted today by the history of our adherence to the European Convention on Human Rights and its voluntary incorporation into our law through the Human Rights Act. But it is an example of an international treaty that has nothing to do with the EU. It derives from our membership of the Council of Europe, which has nevertheless led to disagreements as to its value. The government is currently promoting legislative ideas to scrap the Human Rights Act and replace it with what it calls a British Bill of Rights, which I think, it is clear, is intended to limit the operation of the convention in this country. Now, an examination for me suggests that the overall impact of the convention has been beneficial. It was created in the early 1950s, in large part by UK lawyers, and over the years it's been operated as a living instrument, which has allowed it to develop organically and in accordance with social change, just as has our common law. Its application in this lively and relevant manner has produced landmark decisions which have challenged or halted practices which were once considered acceptable, but which would now be recognised as unacceptable by the overwhelming majority of the British public, and indeed Western democracies generally. Just to take a few examples. State discrimination against children on the grounds of illegitimacy. Criminalisation of homosexual acts in private. Blanket retention of DNA obtained by the police from people who have since neither been charged nor convicted. Flogging as a criminal punishment. Excluding same-sex couples from new civil partnership laws. The presence of military officers in some countries sitting in civilian courts as judges, placing a positive obligation on adherent states to stop people trafficking as it's classified as a form of slavery. Despite difficulties over the enforcement of some of its judgments, the Strasbourg court that supervises the convention can show that it's been instrumental in bringing about positive change by governments and public authorities, often in countries with little history of democracy and long track records of human rights violations. It's even helped to transform human rights standards in non-member states. Our willingness, for example, to follow the Strasbourg court judgment scrupulously in the case of the deportation of Abu Qatada, who you may remember, to Jordan, despite the fury of a section of the tabloid press, in actual fact helped ensure permanent statutory reform to the Jordanian criminal justice system, which was both needed and welcomed, as well as actually eventually getting him deported from the UK as well, so that he could stand a fair trial in his country. Our support for the convention has thus been a major achievement of British soft power on the international stage. But there will always be downsides to any form of international legal cooperation and treaty making. On occasion, the European Court of Human Rights produces decisions that are questionable, as was the one on a blanket ban on convicted prisoners voting against the blanket ban on convicted prisoners voting in elections that we had in this country. That long-running impasse with our government has, however, now been resolved with hardly anyone noticing. Another criticism is that it allows for the development of our law by decisions of a non-national court, not by debate and laws passed by Parliament. And that was one of Lord Sumption's critiques of the Convention in his Wreath lectures. He considered the rights of the Strasbourg Court had added by interpretation, the rights that the Strasbourg Court has added by interpretation have transformed it from an expression of noble values into something meaner. It's become a template against which to assess most aspects of the domestic legal order, including some highly disputable ones, and the result has been to devalue the whole notion of universal human rights. And he goes on to say, many people will feel that some at least of the additional rights invented by Strasbourg ought to exist. I think so myself, but the real question is whether the decision ought to be made by judges. Lord Sumption didn't, however, advocate some particular solution to this issue, beyond a call on both Strasbourg and national domestic judges to exercise greater care in determining how far it's right to differ with democratic institutions. His caution, I think, is wise, as any solution to this issue is proving elusive. It's also clear that as a result of interventions from judges and former judges such as himself, there is a lot of evidence of greater restraint by judges of the European Court of Human Rights today than was the case a few years ago. It's of course possible for us to leave the Convention if we wish. It's our undoubted sovereign right to do so. But such a proposal ought to lead to a cost-benefit analysis that I would suggest is heavily favourable to continued engagement. If we were to leave, it would jeopardise our role in the Council of Europe, the key forum that remains to us to exercise influence in our European neighbourhood for our own and others' benefit, and where our leading role has long been recognised. Make it impossible for us to negotiate security and data sharing agreements with the EU, which are of great importance to our national security, as the basis for that cooperation is underpinned by a shared adherence to the European Convention. It would send a clear signal internationally that we're downgrading our interest in promoting human rights. And we would still have to observe the many other international obligations, such as the UN Convention on Refugees, which limit our freedom of action, unless we choose to abandon them as well. Indeed, the current concerns of the Home Secretary over asylum-seeking migrants crossing the Channel encapsulates the dilemma. Unless their country of origin is prepared to have them back, which many are not, it's in practice impossible to remove them, even if an asylum application fails. Unless you're going to use physical force to prevent them entering UK waters in danger to their lives, the only solution is international cooperation, which depends on our observing the treaties that underpin it, requiring other countries to do so, and striving to build on those treaty agreements. And if we withdrew from the Convention, we'd still be left with the question of whether there should be any rights that enjoy special protection in our country. If there are, and I think the public show no sign of wanting to return to pre-ECHR times, then we're going to spend an awful lot of time recreating many of the same issues in the application of such rights over and over again. Ultimately, if Parliament chooses to allow the judiciary to review decisions made by government departments and ministers about individuals and gives those individuals the right to be treated in accordance with principles of fairness for what are seen by most of us as fundamental principles for living in a free democracy, then those determinations almost always involve striking a balance between competing public interests. I think that lurking behind the current political debate is a wider concern that our judges may have become too active, are ignoring and undermining parliamentary sovereignty, and that the government may be justified in taking some as yet rather unspecified action to curb them. The Conservative Party manifesto in 2019 spoke of ensuring that judicial review is available to protect the rights of individuals against an overbearing state, while ensuring it's not abused to conduct politics by other means. But there's little evidence of such abuse justifying the manifesto's statement, and that was pointed out in a review carried out by Lord Folkes, and the government seems to have largely accepted this. Similarly, the attacks on our senior judiciary over Brexit-related decisions showed, for me, a lack of understanding of our legal process and historic constitutional principles. In the two cases brought by Mrs. Miller, which are now well known, the first on triggering Article 50 without parliamentary involvement, and the second on the prorogation of Parliament for a period of 6 weeks mid-term in 2019, the Supreme Court acted at the instance of a citizen by due process to review decisions taken by a government purportedly made under prerogative powers. It's the well-established right, indeed the duty of the courts to do this. You can see that in cases going back to the early 17th century. The government argued in Miller that it was entitled to trigger Article 50 under the royal prerogative because its action was confined to our international treaty relations and the vast domestic changes to UK law enjoyed under UK statutes that would and have now followed were an incidental consequence of this, being action that Parliament had not expressly or impliedly restricted by statute law. The Supreme Court disagreed, and Parliament duly sanctioned the triggering of Article 50 by statute. Far from inhibiting Brexit, it actually provided it with a structure. The same can be said of the case involving the prorogation of Parliament. Suspending Parliament from sitting, save for the purpose of the few days necessary to start a new session, or as a preliminary to an election, was unprecedented in modern times, and made more questionable by the government's dishonesty in denying it was planning it and in providing a wholly unconvincing explanation as to why it had done it. The action was declared null and void, because the government could provide no reasonable explanation to justify preventing Parliament from carrying out its proper constitutional function. Now that too is a classical application of the principles on which there is a judicial review of government action. In making its unanimous decision, the justices of the Supreme Court dismissed the argument that there could be some prerogative acts which were of such a high political policy nature that the courts could never review them as they were untouchable. Now that's a different argument from the one often accepted by the courts, that they should refrain from pronouncing on the exercise of a power to which the law can provide no answer. That may be irritating for government, but it follows on a pattern of legal development that, as I've tried to show, goes back a long way. And in saying this, I'm not saying that judges always have to be right. Such a thing doesn't exist in human affairs, and as a lawyer, I've frequently experienced occasions when I thought judges have got things wrong. But the working of a modern, pluralist democracy is not compatible with sidelining the courts. Generally, the courts have shown a great deference to Parliament, and the judges are bound by their oaths to the Queen to act judicially. But the louder government and Parliament get in supporting measures that might break the conventions that underpin the constitutional relationship, between the judiciary and the government, the greater the risk of this deference being reduced. In a case called Evans and the Attorney General, which concerned the Prince of Wales's black spider letter correspondence with ministers, I experienced this directly. As the correspondence had been with ministers under the previous Labour administration, it was my, I have to say, rather unfortunate duty as Attorney General to have to decide whether or not to exercise a right of veto provided for in clear terms in the Freedom of Information Act on publication. This gave me the unusual power of overruling a decision of the upper tribunal that the Prince of Wales's correspondence should be publicly disclosed. I exercised that veto, as my own conclusion on review was that the tribunal had got it wrong, and I disagreed with its reasoning. The Supreme Court struck my decision down, not on the basis that my decision was unreasonable, very kind of them to think it was reasonable, but because it considered that Parliament couldn't have intended to give a minister such a power. In the absence of the statute spelling out the power in terms that were absolutely crystal clear, it decided to interpret the statute to confine the ministerial decision to overrule to boundaries so narrowly defined that it made that part of the Act effectively redundant and unworkable for the future. Two of the judges stated in dissenting judgments that the court was not interpreting a statute, it was rewriting it. It was apparent that a majority of the court were deeply concerned at what they saw as a power improperly given by Parliament to ministers to overrule a court judgment contrary to established principles of the rule of law. And it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that the majority of the Supreme Court then engaged in some pretty creative interpretation to find a way of negating the statute while avoiding a stark constitutional collision. But I wouldn't get too worried. Such a collision is rather a doomsday scenario, and fortunately remains hypothetical. The government, after that judgment, could have enacted legislation to overturn it, but it chose not to, probably because it concluded rightly that in fact the legislation had been poorly drafted in the first place. Unless, and I think it would be a very surprising event, and I hope it never happens, we are actually to have a situation where a government decided to try to prevent the courts carrying out their duty of scrutinizing the actions of the executive through judicial review, and thereby sidelining the courts and undermining the rule of law. I can think of no circumstances in which the judiciary would seek to overturn or overrule the sovereignty of Parliament. Finally, in this overview on sovereignty, I think the other thing we can't ignore is devolution. The Act of Union with Scotland of 1707 presupposes that apart from the Presbyterian settlement and the maintenance of a separate legal system, all decisions thereafter would be made in common at Westminster. And actually, even those preserved areas are capable of change by Westminster legislation. But the Union hasn't suppressed identity, and it's in response to issues of identity in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland that devolution of power has been carried out by parliamentary acts. And although Enoch Powell, of all people, once argued that power devolved is power retained, as the Westminster Parliament can legally take back what it's given away, I have to say that 22 years after the first devolution settlement took place, it's difficult to agree with Tony Blair's opinion expressed at the time that the Scottish Parliament was no more than a large local authority. It doesn't square with reality. You only have to look at the divergences on the COVID regulations in the last 2 years to see that. Now, our present Prime Minister has rejected granting another referendum on independence, and constitutionally the power to hold one lies at Westminster. But political reality could ultimately force his hand. Northern Ireland has, of course, the option secured by international treaty to leave the United Kingdom by majority expressed in a referendum both there and in the Republic. The question as to whether Brexit is helping create conditions in which a referendum has to take place remain very much open. I can't, in this afternoon's talk, come up with suggestions as how to those challenges posed by devolution can best be resolved. But the issue is relevant to considering this question about sovereignty, to which we have become so attached. The concepts of sovereignty I've been talking about today have distinctive resonance in different constituent parts of our country, and as a historical narrative, I have to say, are overwhelmingly English. That's not to say that the concept of parliamentary sovereignty and liberties is irrelevant in Scotland, far from it. The Union enables those to be shared, but Westminster parliamentary sovereignty ignores Scotland's own tradition that sovereignty lies with the people. The cross-fertilisation of law and of different visions of identity that has made the Union such a success has also left tensions, as yet unresolved. In Northern Ireland, the issue of identity and how to reconcile different communities and still enable the inhabitants to live in harmony and peace lies at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement. I have to say that a lot of the present debate on our sovereign identity seems to ignore the delicacy of these arrangements completely. There's evidence from recent opinion polling that a significant number of people in England would be willing to sacrifice the union of the United Kingdom so as to have the freedom to pursue their own idea of sovereign identity. Well, that's a choice which people can make, but I have to say, in my view, it would be pretty catastrophic for our country's future well-being, as the creation of the Union was the key event in forming the political community in which we live, and it's helped to deliver the prosperity and peace that we all prize. The government, of course, says it believes in the Union, but that then makes it incumbent on ministers in government who believe in this assertion and who also believe in their very particular assertion of English sovereign identity to explain how they intend to carry all parts of the United Kingdom with them in developing it. In the course of this talk, I've tried to examine some of the complex strands that have gone into the creation of the concept of our sceptred isle. And I hope, in the process this afternoon, I've been able to apply a gentle critique to some of the simplicities which I consider it reflects. But that's not to say that it isn't of value. On the contrary, nation-states, like all communities held together, both by self-interest but also by a shared history and imagination, need those narratives to sustain them and take them forward. They make us feel good about ourselves, and rightly so. And we're blessed in this country that by a mixture of good fortune, the wisdom of our forebears, we have so much of which to be proud and to celebrate, and which is positive and helpful to a shared future. But that makes it all the more important to appreciate it in its context and to beware of the fantasies it can engender. The over-romanticization of sovereignty and identity and associated myth creation can too readily become malign. Our continent, from which we've been distancing ourselves over Brexit on the grounds of our exceptionalism, has plenty of examples of the tyranny of historical narratives. At the moment, with Russia, it constitutes a direct threat to the peace, freedom, and security of both ourselves and our neighbours. Indeed, the threat is so great that our Foreign Secretary went a fortnight ago to attend a meeting of EU foreign ministers just 14 months after the UK government had declined the offer from the EU to invite Foreign Minister regularly to its foreign affairs and defence meetings in areas of continuing cooperation, because at that time we said it might undermine our sovereign freedom of action. The lesson for us all is surely that a successful nation state in an interconnected world must be able to ensure and demonstrate how its own constitutional inheritance and traditions and the pride it takes in them can contribute to a wider good. Thank you very much.
Dominic, I wanted to thank you very much indeed for that excellent R's presentation on this sceptred isle. Is it a political fantasy? we've recently been watching the history of English music on television with Charles Hazelwood, and of the 4 composers who are the foundation, supposedly, of modern English music, 3 of them were German. Such is the complexity of these things. It was not least, I thought about it, it was Handel, Mendelssohn and Bach, and when you talked about John of Gaunt, being from Ghent, Spain and Gascony, it sort of rather reminded me of the same point. But I'm grateful to you for showing something of the complexity over nationality, over sovereignty with its checks and balances, violations, devolution, international obligations, the fact that we've signed 14,000 international treaties, making us the world, what did you say, we are the greatest treaty-making country in world history, all of which fetter our sovereignty insofar as we've entered into an agreement, but we had the sovereignty enabled us to enter into them in the first place. As a former army officer and having served in the British Army for 20 years, I saw the wonderfully beneficial impact of the European Convention on Human Rights, the reversal of the ban on homosexuals in the army, the detention of soldiers, the reform to the court-martial system, and above all, the fact that the convention could reach out to some prisoner we'd beaten up in some foreign hellhole and came to pray their aid. So I'm grateful to you for referring to that. As you rightly said, it is a complex question, and I'm sure there are some questions to follow on now. So I'm going to open the floor to people to ask you whatever question they like.
And please ask me about anything you think I've tried to avoid, you know.
Simple. Thank you.
Sorry. Yes.
Yes. It all seemed to be very simple, but gradually, as as your subject developed, it always seems as if it's like a tree, and it's growing branches and leaves ever more complex. How do you see the future after this wonderful sort of situation that we've been in with Brexit, and more recently with COVID?
I think, looking immediately ahead, there's no doubt that we are in a rather strange period politically. It may partly be the result of Brexit and some of the disputes it engendered, but the current Parliament, the government has a large majority, and the evidence certainly with the COVID regulations is that Parliament cheerfully rubber-stamped the COVID regulations with almost zero scrutiny, and I do think the two things are linked. Now, you can blame people like me. You can argue, actually, if you hadn't had all these tremendous spats over Brexit, then Parliament might have continued in a more normal way. But we're watching a pendulum swinging backwards and forwards. And on the whole, we're living in a period where there appears to be a very high level of irritation within government about restrictions on what government can do. And I suppose if I encapsulated it, it would be to say that my colleagues who are in government, and I'm still in touch with some of them, the attitude seems to be, why can't we go back to those sensible days? Prime Minister with a majority can really do whatever he likes, and if people don't like it, well, they chuck him out at the general election. And obviously, if the House of Commons doesn't like it, then he loses his majority. But in the meantime, there has been quite an emphasis on shortcuts. Now, when I go and address sixth formers, which I used to do a lot of when I was still a constituency MP, I used to explain to them that my view was that we always talk about majorities, parliamentary majorities, but actually the process by which we make decisions in this country is not just, you'll know it at every level, including potentially at your own PCC, it's not just about majorities deciding things, it's about minorities being willing to accept majority decisions. Because without it, it stops working. That's what happened in Northern Ireland. You know, for a long time there was a Protestant majority in Northern Ireland, but its behaviour was such that the Catholic minority would not accept its authority. So you ended up with violence. So actually, we're in danger, I think, of losing an understanding of what makes a successful working parliamentary democracy. And the rise of populism, of simple answers, the rise of a tendency to say, well, you've lost that vote, so you can be ignored, And the failure to accommodate minority interests is, in my view, a real danger to the survival of democracy, not just in this country, but we've seen it elsewhere in Europe. And somehow we've got to swing that back. Now, it may happen naturally, because we're a very resilient political system. We have elections, people do participate, you know, messages are sent out by the electorate to politicians all the time, and politicians do in this country tend to respond to them. But if we lose sight of some of those, I think, basic ABC building blocks of how our parliamentary system works, then I think we're in trouble. And majoritarianism, the tyranny of the majority, as Lord Hailsham described it, is a really serious danger. Because once you get that into your head, you lose sight of the fact that actually government can quickly become impossible. You've got to be able to carry people with you, at least to grudging acceptance of the decisions that you've made. And we're very lucky in this country. We have a constitutional monarchy, which I've always thought is one of the reasons we're able to do that so successfully, because the Queen is above politics, because politicians have to defer to her, because you have to go on one knee and kiss her hand when you become her minister, because you're her servant to enable her to discharge her coronation oath. That's what you're there to do. But when people start running around saying, ooh, I'm implementing the people's will, I do just get a little bit worried, because I'm not 100% sure that we know what the people's will is. Apart from the fact that we pray, I think, in church on the Sunday that we should be godly and quietly governed, and I think on the whole that's probably as close to it as we're likely to get. Yes?
Protest groups. We had protest groups against COVID, which now have changed to protest groups against the invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah.
I mustn't carry on, because if we start talking about Ukraine, then I wonder, we ought to be thinking in terms of Chamberlain in 1939.
Well,
and probably Hitler and all kinds of other manner of things, so I'll refrain.
Right, I will refrain too. The Ukraine is a very serious challenge to our security and raises some enormously difficult issues, which the government has my sympathy as to how we should properly respond. Yes.
Just putting aside for a moment the voice which has been ringing in my ears as I listen to you, the voice of a headmaster saying at the end of that, Turnbull, summarise that, will you? The question I want to put is whether or not you agree that judicial review is overdone, or whether the general public should always have an opportunity to have the last word.
I don't think that judicial review is overdone. Now, it's not to say that it shouldn't be open to reform, and indeed for once, the government does seem to have listened to Lord Foulkes's commission and has introduced some measures which I think are rather sensible, without getting into too much technicality, but you may be familiar with it. The idea of being able to suspend a quashing order seems to me, for example, to make a lot of sense and has been widely welcomed. And I don't actually think the government's legislation on this is in any way improper. Is judicial review overused? Well, of course, that does raise a complex issue. If you have a country where you pride yourself on being able to willingness to provide access to justice, there is the risk that undeserving cases will pile up in court. And I do happen to think that there are quite a lot of undeserving cases which pile up in front of our judges. But the trouble is, who decides whether they're undeserving or not, unless it's the judge himself? Suggestions of sifting systems, the judges do some sifting, actually, with judicial review, because there's an initial application and they can sometimes say this is hopeless and cast it out. But if they're prepared to hear it, it's because they think that there is something which needs to be considered. Then one has to ask oneself the question, are judges running around exceeding their powers, and is there a serious problem with judges in their judicial review findings acting in ways which are irrational or excessive, or are failing to take account of the right of ministers to make difficult decisions? And on that, I have to say I'm unconvinced that we have a sort of out of control judiciary. I really am. It's not to say that every decision that they make is necessarily correct, because they're human beings like us. But I actually think that they provide an important corrective to what are often sloppily made decisions. Now, yes, it costs money, but in the great scheme of things, seeing the amount of money we've been shelling out on, in the last few years, borrowing, it's a drop in the ocean of the government's budget. And so for that reason, I always said when I was Attorney General to my colleagues, you know, you shouldn't see a successful judicial review against yourselves as being a defeat. It isn't. It's part of the process that we have put together in this country to improve your decision-making. And yes, it may occasionally be inconvenient because there may be some adverse publicity. But if you, instead of getting angry about it, you said, I recognize that, whilst I may have argued against it, this is a very reasoned judgment and we will take it on board, you might find the public started to take a greater interest. And I think that's the better approach.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question about the position of the law officers of the Crown, and in particular your previous appointment as Attorney General, because it struck me as increasingly peculiar recently that it should be a party political appointment. After all, the main reason why most commercial organisations go to external lawyers is so that they can get an objective, independent perspective on their own legal problems. Wouldn't it be sensible to do something similar with the Attorney General and have a parliamentary committee appoint a lawyer with 20 years post-qualification experience in the area of public law to advise the government? Thank you.
You raise an important issue, and of course it's one that has been considered previously. Historically, just to explain for other people here present, the law officers have had a strange multi-headed entity. He's the minister in charge of the Crown Prosecution Service and indeed has oversight of all prosecutorial decisions in England and Wales and some reserved powers of interference, although actually the attorney should be there to protect the independence of the prosecutors from any political interference at all. He's the principal legal advisor to government, and he normally attends cabinet, and he's a member of the National Security Council, and he has a key role in advising whether legislation can be introduced into Parliament or it contains powers which are incompatible with international legal obligations. The Internal Markets Bill is an example. And finally, he has, I think, 36 separate functions to uphold the rule of law, bringing contempt of court proceedings against newspapers, jurors who misbehave, getting litigants categorized as declared vexatious. There's a wide range, the ability to refer certain unduly lenient sentences to the Court of Appeal. All those things he has to exercise completely independently of his colleagues, the power to quash flawed, what he thinks or apply to have quashed, a flawed inquest verdict, what I did over Hillsborough. So you're absolutely right that a lot of these functions appear to sit more comfortably with a completely independent lawyer. But, then I think there is a but, in order to function properly and do this, he can't just be a civil servant. He has to be an individual who is trusted within government. And historically, the majority of attorneys in the 20th century succeeded in doing this juggling act. They're politicians, they're appointed to the job. I think it was Harold Macmillan who once famously said to a newly appointed attorney, "You do know your first duty is to the Queen, the second to the House of Commons, and only thirdly to me as Prime Minister." And as long as you keep that in mind, we're probably all right. It's not to say it always goes all right. Lord Goldsmith got himself into trouble over the Iraq advice and whether he'd been lent on by Mr. Blair as Prime Minister. And more recently, there are clearly some problems because I have to say, normally attorneys are very supportive of their successors, and we all try to be helpful because we know that it's actually a rather thankless and difficult task at times. But I can't agree with the current attorney in what she said and did over the Internal Markets Bill, as I indicated. It's just outside, in my view, of the bounds of the credible or the proper. But I do worry that in the United Kingdom, if you don't have a politician who is upholding the rule of law and you replace him with a civil servant who is upholding the rule of law, which is what you're effectively proposing, the civil servant will probably have less traction with government. And therefore, I think there is value in it continuing as a political appointment. Now, as I say, there was a review in 2007-8, which is quite interesting reading if you want to get it down online, which went into this. And I understand the House of Lords Committee is currently looking at the issue all over again. But I think in the light of what's happened with the Internal Markets Bill and the current attorney. But my own view is it's possible to do the two roles, even if attorneys sometimes are quite short-lived in office.
How grave do you think is the danger that members of the Supreme Court will in due course become political appointments as they are in the United States?
I very much hope not. I know that one of the sort of balances to the criticism that's been made that the Supreme Court is becoming more political has been that there have been some think tanks saying, oh, well, why don't the appointments get ratified by a committee of Parliament in the same way as happens in Congress? Perhaps not quite to the same extent. I have to say, I think it would be a huge mistake. I have never, obviously judges of the Supreme Court must be careful about this, but in this country, judges are there to apply and interpret the law. They are not there to bring their own social views, beliefs and prejudices to their work. They may have them, it's inevitable they will, but they have to be tempered by the application of law and precedent. And I think on the whole we get that. And I would not wish to see a situation where in the United States you have this argument, oh well, you know, the court is currently 3 liberals against 6 conservatives. But that said, it's also right to point out that in the United States, their Supreme Court does have a distinctly different role, which our own Supreme Court doesn't have, because of its capacity to interpret a written constitution and rule that some things may be unconstitutional. That's very different from what our Supreme Court did over prorogation. Prorogation, although people sometimes don't seem to understand it, prorogation was nothing to do with it was constitution, in that the power to prorogue is a prerogative power, and that, I suppose, is present in our unwritten constitution. But their capacity to review whether that power is being exercised reasonably or not has been around, actually, in theory, and sometimes operated in practice for centuries. So I would prefer not to see our Supreme Court subject to scrutiny. We have a good system to parliamentary and political scrutiny before appointment. We have, I think, a good judicial appointment system. It certainly works well, I think, at the top. And it's essentially independent. It does provide for some opportunity for political input, but ultimately it ensures that the people appointed are not being appointed for political reasons.
I think at that point it's an appropriate point to draw an end to the lecture, unless there are any further questions that someone would like to ask. Any further questions? I wanted to thank you enormously for this wonderful erudite lecture that you've given us this afternoon. I said at the beginning that we haven't had a St. Cuthbert's lecture for the last 2 years, and this was third time lucky. But now it's re-established. You have set the bar very high indeed. So I'd like to invite everyone to give you a very warm round of applause for the wonderful event.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure.